I just go show a little bit from the Shmuz.
He didn't speak for 20 minutes, right?
How long did
If he was invited to speak, he spoke for 45 minutes.
It must have been, I once saw someone in the Chavetz Chaim in the bottom. They said that Chavetz Chaim gave us Shmuz once for 4 hours. And then some people got anxious. It was getting late for Mincha, and he got upset. Why they get anxious? It's a tzarchik tzibur. Okay.
They by Levi's, by Gedolim, they used to have a Levi for 8 hours.
Yeah, okay. Okay. So Rebbe Shvei spoke about it. It was this week's parsha was Achrei. It works out even better this year for us because we have Achrei, Mois, and Kedoshim. He points out this is something we mentioned in this week's parsha and next week's parsha. We have both this week, so it's like a topic in both parshas speak about. It says in this week's parsha, the pasuk says, also, but even before we start, he picked this topic to speak about. He had from the whole parsha, he focused on a certain point here that he felt was important. And again, I said this is 39 years ago. He said, the pasuk says, "Kamai se'eretz Mitzrayim asher yeshavtem ba lo sasu." The Yidden coming out of Mitzrayim. So Hashem says you shouldn't act like the people in Eretz Mitzrayim where you lived. And Ukamai Eretz Canaan, and also you're going now to Canaan. Ukamai Eretz Canaan Ashani Mevi Eschem Shama Lo Sasu. You shouldn't be like the Goyim in Eretz Mitzrayim, and you shouldn't do like the Goyim in Eretz Canaan. V'chukaseyim Lo Selechu. That's in this week's parsha. The next week's parsha is a very similar pasuk. It says, "Leisechu b'chuk is in Parshas Kedoshim. Leisechu b'chukas hagoy shani mishleach mipnechem." Don't be like the goyim that I'm sending out before you and me in Eretz Yisrael. He has called Eila Osul. This is what they did. Terrible things. V'okaspam. I despise the goyim in Eretz Yisrael. V'ayim lechem atim tirshu es admosim. You're going to take over the land. V'ani enenu lechem l'reshes oisem eretz alis chol vash. And he says, "Ani Hashem lekechem asher dalti eschem min ha'amin." You should be different than the Goyim. So this is what he wants to talk about, the influence of the Goyim in Golis and not to be like the Goyim. That's the topic there, but he chose to speak about it at this gathering. But he brings the Teres Kahanim on the first pasuk in Achrei Mois, and it says like this: Minayin, how do we know that there was no other nation that was lower than the Mitzrayim? That the Maisim, that the way they behaved was worse than the Mitzrayim? And then he says, Minayin l'dor achron, the last door, that they were the worst of all, says it sounds like Mitzrayim was going down in their level of whatever the behavior, and they were at the lowest level when the Yidden were there, and they don't be like them. And then he says in Teres Kahanim, that he says, Minayin, how do we know this? L'mokum sheyoshu ba Yisrael, that where you didn't live, shesivu maseim yoisem mikulam. Not only was Mitzrayim in a low level, but where the Yidden lived was the worst level. They lived in the worst neighborhood as far as what was around them. He says, because it says in the pasuk, asher yeshavtem ba, where you dwelled, loisas, don't do like them. And then it says, Shver Azachir, uminayin sheyeshivasam shal Yisrael garmu lahem. How do we know that because the Yidden were there, that caused the Goyim to be like this? It says, again, Minayin, Sheshivasam Shal Yisrael Garmu Lahem, the Yidden living there caused them, L'chol Amais Malolu, Tamlar Sheshaftim Ba L'Sasbu. Because you lived there. That's why they were like that. Really plain. And I'll be Makatsu, but you see, he brings the next shtickle the same about going into Canaan. This was about Mitzrayim. Mamish, the same thing about Canaan. Canaan was the worst, the lowest, and that time they were the lowest, and where they lived is going to be the lowest. And then it says the same thing. Minayin should be Osam Shal Yisrael, because Yidden came there, Garmu Lahem. Because Yidden came there, that's why they were at such a low level. So it's really plain. So he says, what does this mean? Because they were Yidden were there, that's why they were lowest level. So I glad I looked up the Teres Kahanim. The Malbim there, Taka says, it doesn't mean like it sounds. It means the Yidden, because Yidden were there, they were going to go. The Yidden will be affected in the future. He wants to turn around, but that's not the lashon of the. But Rebbe Yeshivas brings something interesting from the Satmar Rebbe. He brings a pshat in this Teres Kahanim. He says, "Arisi la'admor misatma Shehizbezois. In his Sefer Divrei Yoel, he says he found that the Tam Rebbe speaks about this Torah's Kahanim, and he says like this: the Tam Rebbe says that what's the job of the Yetzer Hara? He wants to be Machshel Yidden. He wants to give the Shonis for Yidden. And he says sometimes he's not successful to get to the Yidden directly. The Yidden don't want to listen to him. So his tactic is to bring the Goyim down to a very low level, and the Yidden would be influenced by the Goyim. That's what the Shat Rebbe said is the pshat in this Torah's Kahanim. That because the Yidden lived there, that's why they were so low. It doesn't mean the Yidden brought them down. It doesn't mean the Yidden, they were like the word sound almost. But it means because the Yidden were there, that's why the Yetzer Hara brought them down. There's a purpose. The Yetzer Hara brought down the Goyim specifically. They focused on the Goyim that are surround the Yidden. Let's affect these Goyim. Let's bring them down to a low level. So this way, the Yidden will be affected. Because he doesn't mention it, but that's Pashut. I'm learning that with Binyamin about in the Sefer. We learn about the Rambam says that a person is affected by his surroundings. It's human nature. But that's what Rebbe says. And then the Rebbe Yisrael brings that the Vilna Goyim said there's two types of Yetzer Hara. Follows from this thing is Yetzer Hara mi b'fnim and is Yetzer Hara mi b'chutz. And he says the Yetzer Hara mi b'chutz is stronger than the Yetzer Hara mi b'fnim. The Yetzer Hara, the influence the Yetzer Hara can have on us from what's around us is more than the Yetzer Hara could have on us inside of us and penetrating inside of us. And he says that Rabbi Yochanan, the Mir Mashgiach, said that he was always found it very difficult. Where did the Vilna Gaon know this? That the Yetzer Hara from the outside is stronger than the Yetzer Hara from the inside. So he said that he thinks he got it from these psukim. The Torah warns us so much not to be affected, not to do like the Mitzrayim, not to like the Knanim. You don't find so much the Torah warning us about our own Yetzer Hara. He says that's pretty much medayik, that it's a very strong influence where we are in Golis, the influence of the Goyim on us. And he said that's what is talking about here. That Torah is telling us don't imitate the Goyim, don't learn from the Goyim. And they're at their lowest level. Whenever the Yidden are, the Goyim are the worst, and don't learn from them. That's what he says. So the Rebbe Yisrael says that we can see this now. In our times, he says, Kamidumani, if we think about it, we can see this happened in America. He said that in recent times, again, he's talking 40 years ago, he said that there's been a big drop in the Goyim, in the Goyish Welt, in Sneas, he says, and in family life. He said in this drop, he says, it wasn't a drop that happened slowly. It was like a sudden drop. It came a big fall, not just a little bit at a time. It was a big drop in the moral standard of the Goyim in regard to tznius and in regard to family life, he says. And he says, it's possible this is the Hezber. He says, because Baruch Hashem has been a strengthening in Torah. In Yiddishkeit, he says, it's chaskos biyadus. There's a generation of Bnei Torah growing. So the Yetzer uses this tactic. He brings down the Goyim, and he brings down the Musar amongst the Goyim, and this is the Yetzer Mibachutz, and this is a tactic that the Yetzer has. And this is what the Torah is talking about in our parsha, in this week's parsha, both parshas that we learned this week's parsha. So he says this all is a kavanah to try to bring down the Yidden. This all is a sign for the Yidden. So now he says, we said the pasuk b'chukasayim leisalechu. So what are these chukasayim? He said that the Torah already tells us not to avoid Zorah, not to do all the rayas. We have this. The Torah tells us in detail what we're not supposed to do. So what does it mean b'chukasayim leisalechu? What are these chukim of the goyim? He says. That's the next step that he wants to talk about. Rashi already speaks about it, and in the parsha. Rashi tells us on this. Rashi says it means not to go to their theaters where they used to have animals fighting with each other, to the stadiums where they had these kind of things. Rashi brings. So he says that these goyim don't have much of a purpose in life. He says, so they find things to do to keep them busy, to So he says that they have a goyish mitzias, and he says like this. He brings, for example, the Noid of Yehuda about hunting. He says if Ruach speaks about this, that someone there was a very wealthy Yid, who was a Shemitah mitzvahs, who owned a lot of properties and forests and jungles, and he asked the Noid of Yehuda if he's allowed to be a hunter for a sport. Like, can he do this to hunt animals? Maybe it's Tsar Balachayim, maybe it's Baltashkis. That were his kashas. So Noid of Yehuda is said to answer him that those happen not to be a problem. And the Tshuva says why, if there's a purpose for a person to do it, it's not Tsar Balachayim, and if it's not Baltashkas, because there's no purpose in these animals, for no one's getting anything out of these wild animals, and if anything you get from it is after you kill it, you can get the skins. There's a Tshuva says that these problems are not a problem. But then he says, after he finishes, he says mitzad din, but then he says that even if you put the halachas aside, he says, but I'm very puzzled at your question, he says, because we don't find in the Torah hunting except by Nimrod and Esav. By the Goyim, there's such a thing as hunting. But he says it's not the derech of Yidden to be a hunter, he says. He says a Yid should be betach hashket b'shanim b'beisai, not to waste his time with such things. And then he says more, he says that we find that I just happened to learn this yesterday with Eli Sklar, and we're learning Mishnah Berurah. We're learning about Shachionu, these kind of Yemen. So it says there, if someone has a new beged, so people say to him Tischadish. So you need to say Tischad. He says Tischbalev Tischadish means you got a new suit, you should wear it till it gets ruined, and then you should be able to buy another one. But then it says if it's something made out of leather, we don't say this, because to make another one means you'd have to kill another animal to get the leather. So we don't want to tell a person you should have a new leather shoe, because it means you're saying you want to kill him, we should end up killing another animal. So the Ramah says, even though this is a very shvacha reason, because, as they explained, because there's plenty of dead animals that die without killing them, they're dead anyway, and when there's plenty of leather around, you're not going to kill another animal because this guy needs a shoes. But he says, Im kol zeh, the meaning is that we don't do this. So he says, you see, because Rachma v'kol ma'asav, you see how far the sensitivity of a Yid goes, that he doesn't want to say get new shoes because you have to kill another animal, even though it's not. That's one thing. And then the Nebuchadnezzar brings this, that you see that Yidden are very careful about not stam killing an animal, stam is like not Yiddish zach. So he says this is a example. The rebellious Shvei is bringing this example. This is not, the Torah never said an isser on hunting. It never said an isser on going to a stadium to watch animals kill each other. But this is not. This is b'chukosayim. This is what the Torah means. B'chukosayim loisei leichu. Not to become. Then he brings here also. He says that he once heard. It's like this. He remembers the Shmuz that he heard from the Yeshivas at Salmi, from Rabbi Kotler, and he says that these are the words he said, a few words, and these words are still ringing in my ears. He said he included himself in the sentence. He said, Rabbi Kotler said, "Who are we? We're children from the New York streets." He said about him, we. He said to the yeshiva, "We are children of New York streets." He says, if you go once on the subways, you're affected by the subways. He said, "But was is das einmal durchfahren in dem subway?" This I said. One time on the train, you're a New Yorker. He said, you're children of New York. So he says that the Rebbe Shvei says, I went with Rabbi Kotler, he says, many times on the train. In the company of, and he says, he sat the whole time with the Mishnah Berurah. I don't know what he saw already on the train, what did he see on the train? But he said they were affected by one train ride in New York, he said. Rabbi Kotler said about him, he said. So he says that, he said and he says that was 40 years ago. When he spoke Rabbi Elia spoke 40 years ago. That we heard from Rabbi Kotler 40 years before that. So we're talking about 80 years ago on the subway, something like that. And even that had an effect. You see how the goyim live, how they talk, how it has a certain hashpah. Then he says that we say Ashrei Yesh Lehalach Basas Rishoyim De'achas and Moshe Leitzim LeYoshev. So he speaks about this Moshe Leitzim. We go things about Leitzim. Then he says that he brings also a Mordek Maisa that I never heard. I know maybe Elam heard this. He said Rabbi Kiva Eiger, I did a shidduch with somebody. I know this time. I don't think this time. This Maisa, you'll see. He was mishadek with him chut. He doesn't say who it was. And he says that when he came to the chasana, Rabbi Kiva Eiger asked his mechutin, are you happy with it? You know the Maisa?
Yeah.
You know the Maisa? I never heard this Maisa. I don't remember. He said, are you happy with everything okay? So he said, I'm happy with everything except for my mechutin, which was Rabbi Kiva Eiger. I'm happy with everything but the mechutin. So he said, a little while at the chasana, Rabbi Kiva Eiger disappeared. They couldn't find him by the chasana where he was. So they finally found him in a room, and they asked him what happened. Why is he in the room? So he said, "We're in the middle of chasana. You know what's going on? You're the zayda, whatever he was here, the father. I don't know what." So he said that the mechutin told me he's not happy with me. He said. So he says that means that he found some kind of chesaron in me. So I went to this room to figure out what chesaron could he have seen in me. That's what he was trying to figure out. So the people that went, they said they figured out right away. They said they were astounded. They said, no, he was just joking. They told him. So he said, I'm sure he's very happy to be Yom Chod. He just make a joke. How could he be not happy? So Kiva Eiger said, in that case, this is worse now. He's Litzonis, he said. How could I be Meshadek with someone that says Litzonis? So I don't know what happened after that.
Was the cooper ready or not?
So he says, Rabbi Kiva Eiger, you see what Litzonis was, he says. He says the Moshe Leitzim. But he says, okay, so then he says like this.
Kiva Eiger with I'm Kedem, he was with Kiva Eiger.
What he was?
Kiva Eiger, they asked about a bracha or something. There's an egg on the table. I think this was Kiva Eiger, I'm not sure. And he said, I'm Kedem, and he broke up the shidduch. So he's making a joke about it. Well, that was the end of the shidduch. You have for Kiva Eiger too.
Wow.
Yeah.
So he said like
jokes in the morning with Kiva Eiger. By telling you, yeah.
So he speaks about this. I want to find, I could find this. Right, so somewhere here, he talks about television. He says, he says that, he said, I don't really have to speak about this. Like I lost the place here somehow. But he says, he's magdim that I don't really shouldn't have to speak about here, this gathering. But in case there are some people that have it, he says they have, and that means they have in their house. It's not a complete Yiddish house. He said they have a Yiddish house with a shtickle Goyish house. He said from this there's terrible things that could be seen there. He said, and so he brought it up, this Indian. So anyway, the obvious thing to bring out is this was, again, 40 years ago, television was the problem, and some about the 80 years ago. But we have this problem, I don't know how many times more in nowadays, with everything everyone's in his hand. They have everything in their pocket, everything in the kosher, not kosher, and such a confusing, difficult times for people. Just to mention this Indian, to chazik these inyanim, to think about these things, that the Torah is warning us not to be like the goyim, not to be part of the goyim, not to go in their ways, not to be influenced with what their entertainment is, how they spend their time, what's important by them, and as I weiter. So this is for us to be machazik in these inyanim that he spoke of. This is what he spoke about. So I'm just being mamshech. This was the important message in his time. Alachas kama v'kama in our times. And we should be zeicher to lose man. We should be zeicher to be matzliach and to go on the derech of the Torah to show. Yeah.
Also with a shit.